At the final inspection of the new production line, Isabella Whitmore looked at Mason Reed the way someone might look at an oil stain on a factory floor. She called him a garage dad, a grease-stained man who knew nothing beyond patching old trucks, then ordered security to remove him from the control room. Mason did not argue. He studied the trembling rhythm of the machines and said quietly that if she started the line today, her $300 million factory would stop right here. 30 minutes later, alarms tore through the complex and the secret he had buried began to surface. Stay until the end to discover why a poor single father could finally bring a billion-dollar empire to its knees. The garage sat on the edge of Detroit, a low building with a corrugated roof and a single flickering sign that had stopped fully lighting up years before Mason Reed ever started working there. Inside, the air smelled of grease and burnt rubber, and the only sounds were the hiss of an air compressor and the steady clink of tools being set down and picked back up. Mason worked with his head bent under the hood of an old delivery truck, listening to the engine the way other men listened to music, catching a flutter in the idle that most mechanics would have missed entirely. His coveralls were stained, his eyes carried the dull tiredness of a man who slept too little, but there was a sharpness underneath that tiredness that never quite faded. He was not introduced as a hero. He was introduced as a man trying to keep a small business running and a household afloat, nothing more. Joseph Carter, the older man who owned the garage, leaned against a workbench and watched Mason work with the quiet pride of someone who suspected he was watching talent wasted on brake pads and oil changes. He told Mason, not for the first time, that a mind like his did not belong buried under hoods for the rest of his life. Mason wiped his hands on a rag and said only that he needed steady work, nothing complicated, nothing that would put him back in rooms full of people who measured a man by his title instead of his hands. He did not explain further, and Joseph did not push. A moment later, Mason glanced at his phone, saw a reminder about a late payment, and set the phone face down without a word, the weight of providing for his family sitting just behind his eyes without ever being spoken aloud. The quiet was broken by the arrival of a company truck from Whitmore Advanced Manufacturing, hauling a stalled autonomous transport robot that had died somewhere on a delivery route. David Pierce climbed out first, dressed sharply but clearly out of his depth, having heard about Mason through a quiet network of mechanics who spoke of him the way people speak of someone who used to be great at something and disappeared. David explained that the robot had failed during a critical test cycle and that nobody at the plant could determine why. Mason walked around the machine once, knelt beside it, and within minutes identified the issue, not in the motor, but in the sensor synchronization logic buried deep in its control software. David stared at him, stunned, because that exact category of failure was tied directly to the new production line about to be unveiled at the Whitmore plant. David asked, almost pleading, if Mason would come look at the plant quietly before the official unveiling off the books, before anyone noticed a problem big enough to embarrass the company. Mason refused at first, saying he no longer wanted any part of the high-stakes industrial world that had once chewed him up and spit him out. Joseph spoke up gently, reminding Mason that this could be the chance to reclaim something of his old life and earn enough to finally breathe easier. Mason considered it for a long moment, then agreed on one condition. He would look only at the technical problem and he would have nothing to do with the politics inside that building. David accepted immediately, relief washing over his face, and arranged for Mason to come the next morning before the ceremony began. Before locking up that night, Mason stood by his old jacket hanging on a hook near the door, and from an inner pocket he pulled out a small, worn engineer's badge, its edges softened by years of handling. He looked at it for a long moment under the dim shop light, turning it over once before slipping it back into the pocket where it had stayed hidden for years. Nobody had seen it in a long time, and nobody would see it tonight either. He flipped off the lights, locked the door behind him, and walked out into the cold evening air carrying a part of himself that the world had forgotten existed. The Whitmore Advanced Manufacturing Plant rose out of the industrial district like a monument to ambition, a $300 million facility built to automate the production of electric vehicle components, industrial robotics, and advanced sensor arrays. It held contracts with major automakers and government partners, contracts that depended entirely on a flawless unveiling in front of the board, the press, and a roomful of strategic partners. Isabella Whitmore stood at the center of it all, the daughter of the man who built the company from nothing, carrying both his legacy and the quiet suspicion of people who assumed she had inherited her position rather than earned it. The pressure on her was constant, sharpened by a board that wanted results and a public eager to see her stumble. Connor Blake, the plant's operations director, moved through the building with practiced loyalty, smiling at every meeting while privately hoping Isabella would fail badly enough that the board would push her aside and hand him control. He pressed her to start the line on schedule despite warnings from David that the system was still showing irregular vibrations in several key modules. David hesitated to push back too hard, since Connor had already forced him to sign off on the safety certification weeks earlier, effectively binding his hands. Into this tense atmosphere walked Mason, dressed in his garage clothes, utterly out of place among engineers, in pressed shirts and floors so clean they reflected the overhead lights. Several employees glanced at him with open disdain, assuming he was a mechanic called in to service a forklift somewhere in the back. Mason ignored the looks and instead studied the robotic arms, the hum of the servos, the blinking patterns of the sensor lights, and the rhythm of the test conveyor as it ran through its paces. Within minutes, he noticed a faint phase mismatch between the hydraulic press cluster and the safety lock system, a flaw small enough to hide from a casual inspection but large enough to matter once the line ran at full capacity. Isabella spotted him near the central control room and immediately bristled, assuming David had let an unqualified outsider into one of the most sensitive areas of the facility. David tried to explain that Mason had just diagnosed the failure in the autonomous transport robot, but Connor cut him off with a smirk, saying a garage was not a laboratory and had no business near a production floor like this one. Isabella looked Mason over, taking in the stained clothes and tired eyes, and formed her judgment of him in seconds, based entirely on appearance rather than anything he had actually said or done. She told David curtly that visitors without clearance needed to be escorted out before the ceremony began, and turned back toward her team without giving Mason another glance. As she did, Mason's eyes lingered on a control screen behind her, where a string of data was blinking just slightly out of rhythm with everything around it. Isabella demanded that Mason leave the control room immediately, since the unveiling ceremony was about to begin and she had no patience left for distractions. Mason stayed calm and told her plainly that the system was not ready, and that running it at full load would cause a crosslock failure somewhere along the production line. Connor laughed out loud and asked what qualified a stranger to draw a conclusion that an entire team of trained engineers had apparently failed to notice. Mason did not mention degrees or credentials. He simply pointed to three signs: an uneven vibration in the drive coupling, a delayed response in the thermal sensors, and an unusual reset cycle occurring in the 7th control unit. David's face went pale because everything Mason described matched a flaw he had personally flagged weeks earlier, only to be ordered by Connor to bury it and move forward anyway. Isabella assumed Mason was simply trying to drum up a large repair contract for himself, a stranger looking for an opportunity inside a company far beyond his world. Connor poured more fuel on the moment, telling the room that Mason was nothing more than a single father who patched up old cars and had no understanding of what it meant to run a $300 million operation. Isabella's patience snapped completely, and the words left her mouth before she fully considered them. He was just a garage dad, and he had no right to interrupt the future of her company. The room went cold. Several employees lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with how sharp and personal the insult had landed in front of so many people. Mason did not raise his voice or show anger. He only asked Isabella whether she wanted to hear the truth, or whether she wanted to hear whatever would keep the board comfortable for one more afternoon. Isabella chose power instead of truth, ordering security to escort him out of the building so the unveiling could proceed exactly as scheduled. Before he was led away, Mason turned back one last time and said clearly that if she started the line today, her $300 million factory would stop right there, in that very room. Connor mocked the line as a pathetic threat against a chief executive, but Mason answered quietly that machinery did not care who gave the order, whether it was a chief executive or a man from a garage, and that a system running out of rhythm would stop regardless of titles. He was walked out without resistance, his expression unreadable, while Isabella turned her attention back to her notes and gave the order to proceed with the ceremony exactly as planned. Out in the glass-walled hallway, Mason stood with his hands in his pockets, listening as the production line roared to life behind the thick glass. He closed his eyes for a moment the way a man closes his eyes when he already knows, with quiet certainty, exactly what is about to happen next. Reporters, board members, and strategic partners filled the observation deck overlooking the production floor, cameras ready, voices buzzing with anticipation for what Whitmore had promised would be a historic unveiling. Isabella stepped forward with practiced confidence, telling the room that this facility would return Whitmore advanced manufacturing to the front of the industry once and for all. Connor stood just behind her, smiling outwardly while privately hoping for a failure large enough to finally end her run as chief executive. The line began at a low setting, and for several minutes everything appeared smooth, with robotic arms moving in clean synchronization and every monitor displaying strong performance numbers. Isabella allowed herself a small breath of relief, certain now that Mason had simply been exaggerating to make himself appear important. As the system climbed towards 60% capacity, a faint metallic shriek cut through the noise of the floor, a sound so small that most people in the room missed it entirely. Mason, standing in the hallway outside, heard it immediately and felt his stomach tighten with the certainty of a man who already knew what came next. Inside the control room, David noticed a sudden spike in thermal readings, but Connor pressed him to stay quiet, warning that halting the demonstration now would cost the company its most important contract. When the line reached 82% capacity, the seventh robotic cluster slipped out of cycle, the secondary conveyor failed to lock in time, and the safety sensor responded half a second too late to prevent what followed. A robotic arm struck the wrong position, shattering a component cluster worth millions of dollars in an instant. The failure cascaded outward into neighboring systems, and within seconds, alarms shrieked across the entire facility as red warning lights swept through every corridor. Isabella, panicking, ordered an emergency shutdown, but the system would not fully comply, its modules locked together in a chain reaction nobody had anticipated. A group of workers in the auxiliary section found themselves trapped when such safety doors malfunctioned and locked into the wrong position, the danger immediate without tipping into anything irreversible. Connor wasted no time blaming David, suggesting loudly that sabotage from an outsider might be responsible, his eyes cutting pointedly toward the hallway where Mason had been escorted minutes earlier. Security moved to hold Mason back, but he stayed calm and told them plainly that if they wanted to save the factory, they needed to let him back into the control room immediately. Isabella resisted at first, unwilling to admit she had been wrong in front of everyone watching, but when she saw the temperature spiking in the press cluster and the rising risk of fire, she had no choice left but to call him back. Mason walked back through the same doors he had been thrown out of only an hour earlier, and the expressions that had once held contempt now carried nothing but confusion and fear. Isabella looked at him and, for the first time, did not see a garage dad standing in front of her. She saw the only person in the entire room who remained completely calm. Mason called out instructions immediately, telling the team to disable automated control on the upper level, isolate the seventh module, switch the hydraulic pumps to manual operation, and open the auxiliary escape route for the trapped workers. David stared at him in disbelief, because those exact steps were only known to someone who had once helped design the facility's core control architecture. Connor tried to intervene, insisting Mason had no authority to touch the system, but Mason answered that continuing the argument would cost them the entire factory. Isabella made the call in seconds, allowing Mason to take control under David's direct supervision. He worked without flair, listening to the machines, watching vibration ripple across the surface of water in a paper cup he had grabbed from a nearby desk, then calling for pressure to be reduced one stage at a time. He soon realized the failure was not a simple sensor glitch but a deliberately altered line of coordination code, one written specifically to bypass a phase deviation warning that should have triggered minutes earlier. David was stunned, since only someone with high-level operational access could have modified code buried that deep in the system. Mason asked for the changelog to be pulled immediately, and Connor quickly claimed the data had been corrupted during the incident. Mason did not argue the point. He simply moved forward, with stabilizing the line first and settling questions later. Using an auxiliary panel, he entered a sequence of legacy commands that no longer appeared in any current manual. Slowly, the vibration began to fall. The seventh robotic cluster locked into its correct position, the secondary conveyor released, and the auxiliary doors finally opened, freeing the workers trapped inside. Isabella watched every number on the screen settle back into a normal range, and for the first time, she understood that Mason had not been guessing at anything. A young engineer nearby asked Mason where he had trained for something like this, and Mason answered only that he had once worked with systems very similar to this one, nothing more. Once the immediate danger had passed, Mason insisted that the plant not be restarted until a complete audit of every system had taken place. Connor objected fiercely, warning that halting operations now would cost Whitmore its most valuable contract. Mason turned to Isabella and told her plainly that she could lose a contract today, or she could lose the entire company tomorrow. Isabella said nothing, the first true silence Mason had drawn from her since the moment they met. He stepped away from the control panel and left the screen glowing behind him, displaying an error log that had been quietly hidden 3 weeks earlier, waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to find it. After the incident, the board convened an emergency session and demanded that Isabella explain exactly what had gone wrong inside her flagship facility. Connor steered the conversation skillfully, framing the story as one where Isabella had allowed an unidentified mechanic to interfere with a sensitive system, exposing the company to serious legal risk. Isabella found herself caught between the truth that Mason had saved the factory and the humiliation of having insulted him publicly only hours earlier. Grace Miller, the company's internal counsel, began quietly looking into Mason's background to prepare a proper legal report before the next board meeting. Grace discovered that the name Mason Reed had once appeared in connection with a classified industrial project involving automated coordination systems for defense-related manufacturing facilities. His public record cut off abruptly 3 years earlier, shortly after a serious industrial accident that pushed him out of the field entirely. Isabella drove to the garage that evening, not to apologize yet, but to ask Mason directly who he truly was. Mason did not want to discuss his past. He told her instead that her factory had been deliberately altered and that someone wanted her to sign off on the unveiling while the flaw was still sitting inside the system. Isabella felt frustration at his coldness, yet she could not dismiss anything he had told her, since every word so far had proven true. Joseph quietly told Isabella, away from Mason's hearing, that the man she had called a garage dad had once been among the most gifted young engineers in the industry, blamed unfairly for a system failure that his superiors had deliberately covered up. Mason lost his career, his reputation, and chose a quiet life afterward to protect the small family depending on him. Isabella began to see her own reflection in what had happened to him, realizing she had treated Mason exactly the way the industry had once treated him, judging him by appearance and title rather than substance. Still, Mason refused to return to the plant if Isabella only wanted him as political cover for her own survival. He demanded full independent technical authority and a guarantee that no findings would ever be hidden from anyone, regardless of how damaging they became. Isabella hesitated, knowing that level of transparency could send Whitmore's stock falling sharply if the truth ever became public. Mason finished the conversation with a single sentence that stayed with her long after she left the garage. The truth never destroys a factory, only the people who hide it do. Grace continued combing through internal records and discovered that Connor had repeatedly pressured David into altering safety reports over the previous several months. David admitted to Grace that he had warned Connor about the system's deviation months earlier, only to be threatened with the loss of his job and his professional license if he pushed the matter further. Connor, meanwhile, had been secretly negotiating with a rival corporation to acquire Whitmore at a reduced price, once the plant failed and the company's value collapsed under public scrutiny. Isabella still lacked enough hard evidence to confront Connor before the board, since every compromise document carried David's signature or the names of junior engineers instead of his own. Mason returned to the plant in a temporary advisory role, though many managers still treated him as an outsider who did not belong inside the building. Connor used internal communications to spread the idea that Mason had once been fired for a technical failure in his past, hoping to turn the staff against him before he could dig any deeper. A handful of employees grew suspicious of Mason because of it, but he never bothered defending himself, choosing instead to stay focused entirely on the production line. While reviewing the system, Mason found a hidden patch buried inside the code, designed to activate only once the plant exceeded 90% operating capacity. Had it gone unnoticed, the next restart would have destroyed the central production cluster and cost Whitmore its contracts permanently. Mason suspected this was not an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage built into the system itself. Isabella began accompanying Mason through his inspections and noticed how he treated every worker with patience, asking detailed questions of the people who operated the machines instead of dismissing them. Connor, by contrast, only cared about polished reports and a clean public image in front of the board. Tension boiled over when Connor publicly demanded that Mason leave the facility, citing his unclear past as a reason he could not be trusted near sensitive systems. Mason answered calmly that his past had not caused the flaw in the line, but Connor's signature on the order to ignore an early warning certainly might have. The room fell silent. Connor's expression hardened as he realized Mason was closing in on the truth far faster than he had expected. Later that day, Connor made a private phone call from an empty office, demanding that someone erase every remaining record before the upcoming audit could begin. Isabella arrived at the garage that evening without an assistant or any security trailing behind her, just a woman in plain clothes standing outside a building she once would have considered beneath her notice. She found Mason still working on a customer's car, treating the incident at the plant as though it had not changed anything about how he lived his life or carried himself. Isabella apologized formally for calling him a garage dad with the contempt she had shown that morning, the words sitting awkwardly in her mouth after years of rarely needing to apologize to anyone. Mason did not forgive her immediately. He told her that an apology was far easier to offer than it was to actually change the way a person looked at those they considered beneath them. Isabella admitted she had grown up in a world where power, credentials, and appearance decided a person's worth long before character ever entered the conversation. Mason told her briefly that after losing his career, he once wanted to prove himself right at any cost, until he realized some people in his life needed him to live peacefully, far more than they needed him to win loudly. A short detail slipped quietly into the moment. Mason took a brief phone call, said he would be home a little later than planned, and ended it, without elaborating further, a small reminder that responsibilities wait for him outside that garage. Isabella began to understand that Mason was not a man who had failed at life, but a man who had chosen not to let his work consume everything he was. She asked him to help her save Whitmore, not merely the factory but the company itself, the people inside it, and whatever integrity it still had left. Mason laid out 3 conditions: a fully public audit, protection for the technical staff from being unfairly blamed, and a promise that if sabotage was confirmed, she would bring the truth to the board even if it cost her the position of chief executive. Isabella agreed after a long silence, the weight of the decision settling over her slowly. Mason also asked that David be allowed to take part, since despite his earlier silence, he still understood the system better than almost anyone and still carried a conscience worth trusting. Isabella accepted, even knowing David's prior silence complicated things. As Mason prepared to leave, he reached for an old toolbox tucked beneath his workbench, and inside it sat a homemade vibration sensor, a relic from an engineering project he had built long before either of them had ever heard the name Whitmore. Mason, Isabella, David, and Grace gathered at the plant late at night to conduct the audit quietly, avoiding any chance that Connor might interfere before they found what they were looking for. The building sat in near darkness, lit only by emergency maintenance lighting, giving the entire investigation the feel of a quiet, tense search through the bones of the facility. Mason found a hidden command sequence buried under an old maintenance account, and the access timestamps lined up precisely with Connor's known work schedule. Grace pulled up a deleted internal email in which Connor pushed for the unveiling to proceed, despite knowing the safety cluster had failed to meet the required standard. David finally confessed everything, admitting that Connor had threatened to destroy his career if he ever reported the flaw directly to Isabella. Isabella felt anger rising inside her, but Mason reminded her gently that anger alone would not repair a broken system. Just as they prepared to back up the evidence they had gathered, the entire section of the plant lost power without warning. Connor had remotely triggered an access override, attempting to erase the records and lock Mason's team inside a secondary control room. Mason stayed composed, switching to a mechanical backup power source that did not depend on the main network, allowing him to reopen an older control pathway that Connor's override had not accounted for. Isabella watched a different side of Mason emerge in that moment, not simply a skilled engineer but a man who had clearly survived real crisis before and knew exactly how to function inside one. Connor's voice came through the intercom, warning Isabella that she should stop now if she wanted to avoid destroying the company through public scandal. Isabella answered him directly for the first time, saying she would rather lose her position over the truth than keep power over a factory capable of hurting the people inside it. Mason located a backup copy of the altered data sitting inside the local memory of the 7th robotic module, evidence Connor had not managed to erase in time. While attempting to recover it, the secondary cooling system activated incorrectly, creating a real risk of damaging the central server controlling the entire facility. Mason faced an immediate choice between saving the data or saving the control hardware itself. Thinking quickly, he used the very same autonomous transport robot he had repaired back at the garage to carry the data drive safely out of the overheating zone, a quiet detail proving that nothing from earlier in the story had been wasted. The sequence demonstrated how every small thread woven into the beginning of the story had a clear and deliberate purpose. The night ended with Grace holding the recovered data drive firmly in her hand, while Isabella stared at a security monitor showing Connor's face, her expression now completely different from the one she had worn toward him only days before. The next morning, the board gathered for an emergency session, and Connor walked in already prepared with a carefully rehearsed attack against Isabella's leadership. He accused her of losing control of the company, of hiring an unverified mechanic with a questionable past, and of putting the entire facility and its reputation at unnecessary risk. Several board members leaned toward Connor's side, worried more about falling stock value and lost contracts than about the truth of what had actually happened inside the plant. Isabella attempted to present her evidence, but Connor moved first, revealing fragments of Mason's old record and claiming he had once been connected to a serious industrial accident. Every eye in the room turned toward Mason, the past he had buried for years suddenly dragged back into the light in front of strangers who held real power over his future. Mason did not flinch or look away. He admitted he had been part of that earlier project, but explained that the record conveniently left out the most important detail. He had been the one who raised the warning, not the one who caused the failure. Connor dismissed this as a convenient excuse from a man who had already lost everything once before. Grace then presented the data recovered from the 7th robotic module, proving that Whitmore's own system had been deliberately altered by someone with high-level access. David stood and testified, admitting his own silence while making it clear that Connor had pressured him repeatedly into hiding safety violations from leadership. Connor fired back, suggesting David was simply protecting himself by shifting blame elsewhere in the room. Mason walked the board through a clear technical breakdown step by step, demonstrating that the sabotage required both elevated operational access and a clear financial motive behind it. Grace followed with additional documents revealing Connor's secret negotiations with a rival corporation interested in acquiring Whitmore at a reduced price. The room shifted, doubt spreading visibly among the board members who had supported Connor only minutes earlier. Connor lost his composure, warning that exposing this publicly its contracts and damage everyone seated in that room. Isabella answered firmly that a company saved through dishonesty was already dead long before any production line ever stopped. The board voted to suspend Connor on the spot, but before security could remove him entirely, he managed to trigger one final action, sending a forced remote restart command straight to the factory floor. While the board meeting still spiraled in confusion, an alarm came through from the plant warning that the system had begun an automatic restart under a high-level maintenance order. If the line ran again before the sabotaged patch had been fully removed, the entire central production cluster would tear itself apart from the inside. Connor, restrained but still smiling, told the room that nobody could stop a command that had already been scheduled to execute. Isabella ordered the plant locked down immediately, but the remote system had already sealed off several layers of control before anyone could intervene. Mason demanded to be taken to the plant right away, and the drive there passed in tense silence. Isabella finally asked him why he was still willing to help her after everything she had said to him that first day. Mason answered simply that he was not trying to save her pride, only the people who actually worked inside that building every single day. When they arrived, workers were already being evacuated from the most dangerous sections, the focus placed entirely on protecting employees, engineers, and the safety team rather than anything else. Mason realized the only way to stop the forced restart was to manually break the synchronization at 3 separate points at once: the hydraulic cluster, the robotic coordination hub, and the auxiliary power core. David took charge of the coordination hub, while Isabella insisted on accompanying Mason to the auxiliary power core herself, refusing his suggestion that she remain safely behind in the control room. She told him this was her factory, her responsibility, and she no longer intended to hide behind anyone else while others took the risk for her. The two of them moved quickly through the maintenance corridors as the entire line began shaking violently around them. A safety door jammed along the way, forcing Mason to rely on raw mechanical experience rather than waiting on a malfunctioning automated system to release it. Isabella saw firsthand the gap between boardroom theory and the brutal reality of the production floor. When they finally reached the auxiliary power core, Mason had to disconnect a critical coupling under enormous time pressure, with seconds standing between stability and disaster. From a nearby security office, Connor attempted one last effort to reactivate the command remotely, but Grace had already coordinated with the security team to cut off his access entirely. Mason counted the rhythm of the vibrating machinery carefully, waiting for the exact moment pressure eased enough to disconnect the coupling without triggering a dangerous electrical surge. Section by section, the line slowed and stopped, the alarms fading out one after another until the building fell into an unfamiliar, welcome silence. The central display finally settled into a steady green status, confirming the entire system was safe. Isabella let out a quiet breath that broke into tears, not from weakness but from the sheer release of finally understanding the true cost of her own arrogance. Mason stood up slowly, his hands scraped and tired, and said only that now the factory could truly begin. Connor was formally investigated for sabotage, corporate fraud, and an attempt to manipulate the company's value for his own benefit, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by the weight of consequences finally catching up to him. David was not cleared entirely, since his earlier silence carried real consequences, but Isabella gave him the chance to testify honestly and correct his mistakes rather than turning him into a scapegoat for everyone else's failures. Isabella held a press conference and stated plainly that the unveiling had been halted because of deliberate internal sabotage, refusing to place blame on the workers or the technical staff who had nothing to do with the deception. She acknowledged publicly that the factory had been saved by Mason Reed, a man she herself had once judged unfairly and dismissed without cause. A reporter asked Mason whether he intended to return to the industry as a senior technical director, and Mason did not answer right away. Grace announced that Mason's old record was being formally reopened, since new evidence proved he had been wrongly blamed for a failure years earlier that was never truly his fault. Watching the news from the garage, Joseph smiled quietly, relieved that Mason no longer had to hide behind grease-stained coveralls just to feel safe in the world. Isabella offered him the position of independent head of systems safety, not as a symbolic title for public relations, but with real authority to veto any decision that endangered the people working beneath him. Mason agreed only on the condition that the role exists to protect frontline workers first, not simply to protect the interests of leadership sitting comfortably above them. Isabella accepted without hesitation and announced that Whitmore would change its entire operating culture going forward, ensuring nobody would ever again be dismissed because of their job title, their uniform, or where they came from. A brief moment outside the main story showed Mason calling home, saying everything was fine now. The conversation kept private and brief, with no further detail beyond his evident relief. The section closed with Mason walking back into the plant, no longer stopped at the door, as the same engineers who once looked down on him quietly stepped aside to let him pass. Several months later, Whitmore Advanced Manufacturing restarted its production line after completing a full audit and a thorough overhaul of every safety system inside the building. This time, there was no extravagant ceremony and no arrogant speech delivered from a stage. Isabella stood instead among the workers, engineers, and operations staff, dressed no differently from anyone else on the floor that day. Mason watched from the control room, needing no spotlight or recognition, content simply to see every reading settle into its correct rhythm. David worked now under a transparent system that no longer forced him to hide safety reports out of fear, finally able to do his job the way he had always wanted to. Grace finalized a legal agreement that allowed Whitmore to retain its most important contracts, built on clear proof that the company had acted decisively to prevent disaster and had reformed its internal systems afterward. Isabella walked over and stood beside Mason, telling him that she once believed any stoppage on her production line meant failure, but she finally understood that sometimes stopping at the right moment was the only thing that kept everyone alive. Mason answered quietly that machines were much like people in that respect, since forcing them to keep running long after something inside had slipped out of rhythm only guaranteed they would eventually break apart completely. Isabella asked whether he ever regretted stepping back into a world that had once hurt him so deeply. Mason told her he had not returned to prove himself superior to anyone, but to make certain that no one else would be crushed under the weight of someone else's arrogance the way he once had been. The line restarted successfully, every robotic cluster moving in clean, steady coordination, the harsh metallic shriek from before completely absent this time. Isabella looked at Mason with genuine respect, free of pity and free of anything rushed or romantic. Simply the quiet recognition between two people who had both been tested and had both come through changed. The story closed with Mason leaving the plant at sunset, walking past a newly replaced sign near the entrance that carried a different internal motto than before, one declaring that safety came before reputation and truth came before power. The lesson settled quietly into place. A man once dismissed as nothing more than a garage father never needed to tear an empire apart to prove his worth. He only needed to make it stop at the right moment, long enough for everyone inside it to finally hear the truth they had been avoiding all along. And as the gates closed behind him, the factory that once nearly destroyed itself through pride now hummed steadily into the evening, running not on fear or image, but on something far more durable, honesty earned the hard way by a man who never once raised his voice to prove it. If Mason's story reminded you that a person's worth is never measured by their job title or the clothes they wear, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Real strength rarely announces itself with noise or titles. It shows up quietly, in the moment when everyone else has lost their composure and someone steady finally steps forward to make things right. Stories like this exist to remind us that respect should be earned through character, not assumed through status, and that the people we overlook most often turn out to be the ones holding everything together. Pass this story along and remember Mason the next time you are tempted to judge someone by appearances alone.